A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
Hey Herman and Corin, we've had a number of episodes about ADHD, but I have a couple more prompts, and I think that if you live with ADHD, becoming well informed about this, it might seem a little bit, I guess, obsessive from the outside perspective, but from the inside perspective, when your successful focus and operating through life is largely dependent upon you understanding how it works and how to optimize your medication regime and diet for your brain can actually be really important. I want to chat today about one topic in the drug treatment of ADHD that I think sometimes doesn't get as much attention as it could, and that is the idea of using booster medications. So we've talked about Vyvanse in a number of episodes, which is a long-acting drug for ADHD that is really popular among ADHD users around the world, including me. And sometimes we find that the effect of Vyvanse isn't as predictable as we might like. It's supposed to last and last. Some people find it lasts far too long. Other people find that they don't actually get the duration from it that they were hoping for and expecting, that it seems to burn through them quickly. And this is where I'd love to talk about the unique metabolic profiles that probably make a really big difference to how two people who take the same drug can process a medication. And we did talk about this in a specific episode about that. But for those who suspect, or maybe they can even confirm, that they're processing the drug more quickly than others, I'd love to chat about some ways, and this is of course a conversation that anyone considering making this actionable would need to have with their medical provider. This is purely all for background information. But if you're going into that conversation, I think it would be useful to talk about treatment strategies that can be employed for either spacing out the Vyvanse, because I know that a lot of patients are instructed by their doctor to take a split dose. A bit controversial as to whether the FDA approves of that, but diluting Vyvanse in water or orange juice or even in applesauce is something that I've heard of a lot of patients doing. That's one way of buffering the drug effect a bit. And the second mechanism is this booster medication. I think a lot of ADHD patients, including me, once we've found and being prescribed a drug that works, we're very wary to approach our doctor and say, it's working, but we've gone through so many hoops and often so much bureaucracy to just get our hands on a reliable supply of one medication that we're very wary to tinker or even give the suspicion that we're looking to add a second one. But for those who kind of have that fear as well, I think it would be worth thinking about this from the perspective of an ADHD patient, because I do think there is just this massive fear of coming across as a drug seeker that you simply wouldn't have if you were on a drug like Lexapro and said it's working, but I feel like I need, it's not working quite well enough. And then of course, it's in your doctor's hands as to what they can do. But I've heard that, I always assumed that if you're on a long-acting drug like Vyvanse, there was no room for a booster med. But I'm thinking about cases where maybe someone is metabolizing faster and they could actually decrease their dosage of Vyvanse so that they have less of it every day, but maybe have that booster on hand, instant release, for when it's finished too quickly, or maybe if they find just for whatever reason they need to extend the duration a little bit longer. It's a particularly challenging situation. So Herman and Corin has talked about the use of booster meds in ADHD. I'd be particularly interested to know about the pairings, because we know that there's the two families, methylphenidate on the one hand and amphetamine salts on the other, and I assume that boosters are generally working within the same family. But I'm curious to know how this works from the actual prescribing practices and the evidence as to this, and of course, from the bureaucratic standpoint that we can't forget about for those in the US and elsewhere, that it might be nice to know that a combination is theoretically possible and medically can be indicated, but quite another to know that they're actually going to get A, a doctor to prescribe it, and B, they're not going to face difficulties at the pharmacy or from their insurance company in actually filling the scripts. Herman and Corn, over to you.
Welcome back to my weird prompts. I am Corn, and I am sitting here with my brother, as always, the man who reads the clinical trials so you do not have to.
Herman Poppleberry at your service. It is great to be here, Corn. We have a really meaty topic today that hits home for a lot of people in our community, including our friend Daniel, who reached out with a very detailed and, frankly, very relatable set of questions.
Today's prompt from Daniel is about the use of booster medications in ADHD treatment. He specifically mentioned the unpredictability of long-acting drugs like Vyvanse and the strategies patients use when those medications wear off too soon. He is also asking about the fear of being labeled a drug seeker and the bureaucratic hurdles involved in getting these prescriptions filled. It is now February 25th, 26, and even though we have seen some changes in the landscape of ADHD care over the last couple of years, these core issues of access and efficacy are still front and center.
It is a vital conversation. We have touched on ADHD many times before, and it is a topic that never really gets old because the science and the patient experience are constantly evolving. Daniel mentioned his own experience with Vyvanse, which is something we explored in depth back in episode 485 when we broke down the specific science of that drug. But the idea of a booster or an instant release add-on adds an entirely new layer of complexity to the treatment plan. It is not just about taking a pill. It is about managing a neurochemical curve over a 16-hour waking day.
It really does, and I think we should start with the core of Daniel's frustration, which is the unpredictability. Vyvanse is marketed as a 12 to 14-hour medication. For many people, that is the gold standard. But, as Daniel pointed out, some people find it wears off much faster. Herman, why does a medication that is supposed to last all day sometimes quit by 2 in the afternoon? I mean, if the box says 14 hours, why are people crashing at hour 6?
That is the big question, and it is the source of so much gaslighting in the medical community. It really comes down to individual metabolic profiles. Vyvanse, or lisdexamfetamine, is a prodrug. This means it is biologically inactive when you swallow it. Your body has to convert it into the active stimulant dextroamphetamine. This conversion happens primarily in the red blood cells, not the liver, which is what makes it unique compared to something like Adderall. But the rate at which those red blood cell enzymes, specifically the proteases, can cleave the lysine molecule off the dextroamphetamine varies wildly from person to person.
So if you are what they call a fast metabolizer, your body is basically chewing through that conversion process at a record pace. You are essentially processing a 14-hour supply in half the time.
Precisely. If your body converts it quickly, you get a higher peak concentration earlier in the day, but then the reservoir of the prodrug is depleted way sooner than the manufacturer intended. For some people, that 12-hour window is more like 6 or 7 hours. By the time they hit their mid-afternoon slump, the medication is effectively gone from their system, and they are hit with what we call the rebound effect. And we have to remember, the 14-hour claim from the manufacturer is an average based on clinical trials. In the real world, biological variance is the rule, not the exception.
We talked about that rebound in episode 834, where we looked at the chemistry of focus. It is not just that the ADHD symptoms return, right? It is that they can return with a vengeance because the brain is suddenly deprived of that steady dopamine support. It is like the lights do not just dim, they blow out.
It is like a sudden drop in cabin pressure. You can become irritable, extremely fatigued, or even more scattered than you were before you took the pill. This is where the booster comes in. A booster is typically a small dose of an instant-release stimulant like Adderall or Dexedrine if you are on the amphetamine side, or Ritalin if you are on the methylphenidate side. The goal is to bridge the gap between when the long-acting dose wears off and when the patient actually needs to be done with their productive day. For a lot of people, their day does not end at 5 p.m. They have kids, they have chores, they have evening classes.
Daniel mentioned 2 specific strategies, split dosing and boosters. Let's look at split dosing first. I know some doctors suggest dissolving the Vyvanse capsule in water or orange juice and drinking half in the morning and half at noon. Is that actually a standard practice? Or is that a life hack that people are doing on their own?
It is a bit of both. The official Food and Drug Administration labeling for Vyvanse does allow for the contents of the capsule to be dissolved in water, orange juice, or even mixed into yogurt. This was originally designed for people who have trouble swallowing pills, like children or the elderly. However, using that method to split a single dose into two smaller doses taken at different times is what we call off-label use. Many clinicians do recommend it for fast metabolizers because it essentially creates two smaller peaks of the medication rather than one large one that drops off too early. It smooths out the delivery.
But there is a downside to that, right? If you take half your dose at noon, and Vyvanse still has that long tail, you might be dealing with serious insomnia later that night.
That is the trade-off. ADHD medication management is a constant balancing act between executive function during the day and sleep quality at night. If you split the dose, you are extending the tail of the medication. For some, that is perfect. For others, it means they are still staring at the ceiling at 2 in the morning because the dextroamphetamine is still circulating in their system. This is why the booster is often preferred over split dosing.
Which brings us back to the booster. A booster is usually a much smaller, short-acting dose. Daniel asked about the common pairings between the two main families of ADHD drugs, the methylphenidates and the amphetamines. Herman, do doctors usually stay within the same family when prescribing a booster, or can you mix and match?
Generally, you want to stay in the same family. In clinical practice, you want to keep the neurochemistry consistent. If a patient is on Vyvanse, which is an amphetamine, the doctor will almost always prescribe a booster from the amphetamine family. This might be a 5 or 10 milligram dose of dextroamphetamine or mixed amphetamine salts, which is the generic for Adderall. The reason is that these drugs work in a very similar way. They both increase the release of dopamine and norepinephrine and inhibit their reuptake. They are speaking the same chemical language.
And what about the other side? If someone is on Concerta or Focalin, which are methylphenidate,
then the booster would typically be a small dose of Ritalin or Focalin instant release. Methylphenidates work primarily by blocking the reuptake of dopamine rather than increasing the release like amphetamines do. Mixing the two families is rare. It is not unheard of, but most doctors avoid it because it makes the side effect profile much harder to predict. You do not want to be juggling two different mechanisms of action when you are already dealing with the complexities of ADHD. It is like trying to tune a guitar where half the strings are nylon and half are steel. It just makes things more complicated than they need to be.
I find it interesting that Daniel mentioned the fear of being seen as a drug seeker. This is a huge barrier. If you are a patient and you tell your doctor, "Hey, my medication is working well, but I need more of it, or I need a second prescription for a different version of it," that can feel very vulnerable. Especially given the history of how these medications have been regulated and the stigma that still exists in 2026.
It is a massive psychological burden for the patient. We have to remember that these are Schedule II controlled substances. There is an inherent suspicion baked into the system. Even though the patient is simply trying to manage a legitimate neurological condition, they often feel like they are asking for a favor rather than a medical adjustment. There is this moral weight attached to stimulants that we do not see with, say, blood pressure medication. If your blood pressure med wears off too early, the doctor just adjusts the dose. With ADHD, the patient feels they have to prove they are not abusing the system.
And it is not just the doctor. It is the pharmacist and the insurance company too. Daniel mentioned the bureaucratic challenges. Let's talk about the insurance side of this. If a doctor writes a script for Vyvanse and a script for a 10 milligram Adderall booster, what happens at the insurance level? Do they just see two charges and move on?
Oh, if only it were that simple. Usually, a massive red flag goes up. Insurance companies have what they call clinical edits or safety edits. Many of their systems are programmed to flag any instance where two different stimulants are prescribed to the same person at the same time. They see it as a duplication of therapy or a potential safety risk. This often triggers a requirement for a prior authorization, or PA.
Which is basically a fancy way of saying the doctor has to write a letter explaining why the patient needs both. It is like a permission slip for adults.
The doctor has to justify it. They have to say, look, we tried a higher dose of the primary med, and it caused side effects like heart palpitations or anxiety, or the patient is a fast metabolizer and needs this booster to function through their workday. It is an extra layer of paperwork that many doctors find exhausting, and it can delay the patient's treatment by weeks. In some cases, the insurance might just flat out refuse to cover the second pill, leaving the patient to pay out of pocket, which, as we know, can be incredibly expensive even for generics.
It feels like a system designed to discourage the very precision medicine we talked about in episode 690. We have the tools to tailor these treatments, but the bureaucracy makes it so difficult to actually implement them. It is like the system wants everyone to fit into a one-size-fits-all box.
It really does. And then you have the pharmacy side. Since the great stimulant shortages of 2023 and 2024, pharmacists have been under even more pressure from the Drug Enforcement Administration to monitor for suspicious prescribing patterns. If they see a patient getting two different stimulant prescriptions, some pharmacists might get defensive or even refuse to fill it if they feel it violates their professional judgment. It puts the patient in this position where they have to defend their own medical needs to three different parties: the doctor, the insurer, and the pharmacist, just to get their medication.
So, what is the evidence for boosters? Is there actual clinical research showing that this is a better approach than just increasing the dose of the long-acting medication? Or are we just guessing?
There is quite a bit of clinical consensus, though I will admit we need more large-scale double-blind studies specifically on booster protocols. The problem with simply increasing the dose of the long-acting medication is that it often increases the intensity of the peak. If you take 70 milligrams of Vyvanse instead of 50, you might feel way too overstimulated, jittery, or cranked up in the morning, even if it does last a couple of hours longer. The booster allows for a more refined curve. You get a manageable peak in the morning and then a small bump in the afternoon to smooth out the descent. It is about maintaining the therapeutic window rather than just blasting the brain with more dopamine.
It is about smoothing the curve rather than just raising the ceiling. That is a great way to put it.
Think of it like a long-distance flight. You have your main fuel tank for the majority of the trip, but you might need a little extra thrust to get over a specific mountain range or to ensure a smooth landing. If you just put a massive engine on the plane, you might burn through your fuel too fast or create too much heat. The booster is that targeted extra bit of energy right when you need it. It is about functional stability.
That makes sense. I want to go back to the metabolic thing for a second. Daniel mentioned that some people find the effects unpredictable. Beyond just being a fast or slow metabolizer, what else affects how long these drugs last? We talked about diet in episode 688. Does that play a role here?
It plays a huge role, especially with the amphetamine family. The acidity of your urine and your digestive tract can significantly impact how much of the drug is absorbed and how quickly it is excreted. If you are drinking a lot of orange juice or taking high doses of vitamin C around the time you take your booster, you might be inadvertently flushing the medication out of your system before it has a chance to work. High acidity in the GI tract can interfere with absorption, and high acidity in the blood can cause the kidneys to clear the drug faster.
So if someone is taking a booster because their main med is wearing off, and then they have a high acid lunch, like a salad with a lot of vinaigrette or soda, they might be sabotaging the very thing they are trying to fix.
And this is why the education piece is so important. A doctor might prescribe the booster but fail to mention the dietary interactions. Then the patient thinks the booster doesn't work, they ask for a higher dose, and suddenly they are in that territory where the doctor starts looking at them sideways, wondering if they are developing a tolerance or seeking a high. It is often just a matter of timing your meals and managing your pH levels.
This brings us to the practical advice for someone like Daniel. If you are an ADHD patient and you feel like your medication is wearing off too early, how do you approach your doctor without triggering those drug seeker alarms? How do you have that conversation in a way that feels professional and data-driven?
Transparency and data are your best friends. Instead of saying, I need more medicine, which can sound like a craving to a skeptical doctor, come to the table with a log. For 1 week, track exactly when you take your med, when you feel it start to work, when you feel the peak, and exactly when you feel the crash. If you can show a doctor a consistent pattern where you are losing focus at 2 p.m. every day, it becomes a clinical problem to solve rather than a request for more drugs. You are presenting a gap in coverage rather than a desire for more.
That shifts the conversation from a subjective feeling to an objective observation. It makes it about the functional impairment.
Right. You can say, look, I am fine from 8 a.m. to 2 p.m., but from 2 to 6, my executive function drops by 60%, and I am struggling to finish my work or be present for my family. That is a functional impairment. Doctors are trained to treat functional impairments. It gives them the justification they need to write that second script and to defend it to the insurance company. It also shows the doctor that you are taking your treatment seriously and monitoring your symptoms responsibly.
And what about the choice between a booster and split dosing? How should a patient think about which one to ask for? If I am Daniel, do I ask for the water titration method or the extra pill?
Well, split dosing is often a good first step because it doesn't require a second prescription. It is a way to test if extending the tail of the current medication helps without adding the complexity of a second drug. However, if the patient finds that taking even a small amount of Vyvanse at noon keeps them awake at night, then the booster is the better option. Instant release medications have a much shorter half-life. They get in, do the job for 3 or 4 hours, and then they are gone. It gives the patient more control over their evening.
It is interesting because Daniel mentioned that he is very technically literate, and many of our listeners are too. They are looking at the pharmacokinetics. They are looking at the half-life. But the bureaucratic system doesn't really care about your technical literacy. It cares about its own rules and its own risk mitigation.
That is the tragedy of it. You can be the most informed patient in the world, you can understand the proteases and the lysine bonds, but you are still subject to a system that was built to prevent abuse rather than to optimize performance. This is why we see so much frustration in the ADHD community. People feel like they are being punished for having a brain that doesn't fit the standard 12-hour medication mold. It is what people call the ADHD tax, the extra time, money, and emotional energy required just to function at a baseline level.
I also want to touch on the family aspect Daniel mentioned. He has a young son, Ezra, and a wife, Hannah. When you are a parent with ADHD, that 5 p.m. to 8 p.m. window is arguably the most demanding part of the day. You are done with work, you are tired, but now you have to do the hardest job of all, parenting. If your meds wear off right when you walk through the front door, it is a recipe for disaster. You are impatient, you are overwhelmed, and you cannot regulate your emotions.
That is a very common scenario. Many ADHD adults actually function okay at work because of the structure and the external pressure. But then they get home, the meds wear off, and they have no executive function left for their partners or their children. In that context, a booster isn't about being more productive at a desk, it is about being a present and regulated parent. It is about being able to handle the chaos of bath time or the frustration of a toddler's tantrum without losing your cool. When you frame it that way to a doctor, it highlights the real-world impact of the medication gap.
It really highlights the difference between treating a condition and supporting a life. We often talk about these drugs in terms of symptoms, but for someone like Daniel, it is about his ability to be the person he wants to be for Hannah and Ezra. It is about his relationships.
And I think that is where the medical community sometimes misses the mark. They are looking for a reduction in symptoms on a scale, but the patient is looking for the ability to manage their life. If a booster allows a father to stay calm and focused during the bedtime routine, that is a massive clinical success even if it doesn't show up on a standard ADHD rating scale. We need to move toward a more holistic view of what successful treatment looks like.
Let's talk about the specific pairings again. Daniel asked about common pairings. We mentioned Vyvanse with an Adderall or Dexedrine booster. Are there any newer medications that are changing this landscape? We're in 2026 now. Has anything new hit the market that solves this crash problem?
There are some interesting developments. We have seen more triple release formulations and some newer liquid formulations that offer a more staggered release profile. There are also non-stimulant add-ons like guanfacine or clonidine that some doctors use to soften the crash. These are alpha-2 agonists that can help with emotional regulation and hyperactivity without the up of a stimulant. Sometimes, adding a low dose of guanfacine in the evening can help bridge the gap and make the stimulant calm down much smoother.
But for the most part, the gold standard for boosters remains the old-school instant-release versions of the classics. Why is that? Why are we still using Ritalin and Dexedrine from the 1960s?
Predictability. We know exactly how 5 milligrams of Ritalin or 5 milligrams of dextroamphetamine will behave in the average body. When you start using more complex delivery systems for a booster, you are just adding more variables to an already complicated equation. The beauty of an instant release pill is its simplicity. It hits fast and it leaves fast. For a booster, that is exactly what you want. You do not want a smart delivery system at 4 p.m. You just want a little bit of dopamine to get you through the next 3 hours.
What about the long-term effects of taking a booster? Is there a risk of building a tolerance more quickly if you are hitting your brain with 2 different peaks of stimulation every day? Does the brain just get used to having that extra bump?
That is a concern that many patients and doctors have. The theory is that the more time your receptors are occupied by the stimulant, the more likely they are to downregulate or become less sensitive. This is why some doctors recommend medication holidays on the weekends to give the brain a break. But for many people, ADHD is a 7-day-a-week condition. It doesn't take the weekend off. The research on long-term tolerance is actually quite mixed. Many patients stay on the same stable dose for years without needing an increase. The key is to use the lowest effective dose for the booster. It is not about getting a second high, it is about maintaining a functional baseline.
It is about that baseline. I think that is the most important takeaway. A booster isn't an extra. It is a bridge. It is the difference between a day that ends well and a day that falls apart at the finish line.
I like that. It is a bridge. And for many, it is the difference between a successful day and a day that ends in a fight with a spouse or a breakdown over a sink full of dishes. We also have to acknowledge the pharmacy shortages that have been plaguing the United States and other parts of the world. Daniel is in Jerusalem, and while the situation there might be different, in many places, just getting one prescription filled is a nightmare. Trying to get 2 different ones filled every month adds another level of stress.
That is a great point. If there is a shortage of the booster, but you have your main med, you are still in a better position than having nothing. But it is another logistical hurdle to clear every 30 days. You can't just get a 90-day supply of these things in most places because they are scheduled too. You are on a short leash.
Always. Every 30 days you are back at the pharmacy, hoping they have it in stock, hoping the insurance doesn't have a new requirement, and hoping the pharmacist doesn't give you a hard time. It is an exhausting cycle for people who already struggle with organization and consistency. It is the ultimate irony of ADHD treatment.
It really is. The treatment for a condition that makes bureaucracy difficult requires navigating some of the most difficult bureaucracy in the medical world. It is like asking someone with a broken leg to run a hurdle race to get their cast.
It is the ultimate ADHD tax, not just in money, but in time, mental energy, and emotional well-being. And for someone like Daniel, who is clearly doing the work to understand his own biology, it can feel incredibly insulting to be treated like a potential criminal just for wanting his brain to work until 8 p.m.
So, looking forward, do you see this changing? We talked about precision medicine in episode 690. Are we getting closer to a world where we can just test a patient's metabolism and know exactly what dose and what timing they need? Are we going to see personalized dosing become the norm?
We are getting closer. Pharmacogenomic testing is becoming more common and more affordable. It can tell us if you have certain genetic variations that affect how you metabolize specific drugs. For example, it can look at the CYP2D6 enzyme, which is involved in the metabolism of many ADHD meds. While Vyvanse is converted in the red blood cells, the resulting dextroamphetamine is still eventually processed by the liver. Having that genetic data can help a doctor realize, oh, this patient isn't a drug seeker, they are just an ultra-rapid metabolizer. It provides an objective, biological explanation for why the meds are wearing off early.
So, even with the best data, there is always going to be that element of trial and error. But at least the trial and error is informed by science.
And that is why the patient-doctor relationship is so critical. You need a doctor who views you as a partner in the process, not just a set of symptoms to be managed. If you have a doctor who trusts your reporting and is willing to work with you on these refinements, you are in a much better position to find that sweet spot. It takes patience and it takes a lot of self-advocacy.
I think that is a really empowering message for Daniel and for anyone else listening. You are the expert on your own experience. If the medication isn't lasting long enough, that is a real clinical data point that deserves to be addressed. It is not a failure of character. It is a matter of pharmacokinetics.
Don't let the fear of stigma prevent you from seeking the treatment that allows you to function at your best. ADHD is a real neurological condition, and the goal of treatment is to minimize the impact of that condition on your life. If a booster is what it takes to get you there, then that is a valid and evidence-based medical intervention. You deserve to have a brain that works for the whole day, not just the first 6 hours of it.
Well said, Herman. I think we have covered a lot of ground here, from the red blood cell enzymes in Vyvanse to the bureaucratic hurdles at the pharmacy. It is a complex landscape, but understanding the mechanisms can really help in navigating it. It gives you the language to use when talking to your doctor.
It really can. And I hope this gives Daniel some useful perspectives to take into his next conversation with his doctor. It is all about finding that balance that works for his specific brain and his specific life in Jerusalem. Whether it is split dosing or a booster, the goal is the same: consistency and quality of life.
Definitely. And for our listeners, if you've had experiences with boosters or split dosing, or if you have found ways to navigate the bureaucracy that we didn't mention, we would love to hear from you. Your stories help other people feel less alone in this process. You can reach us at show@myweirdprompts.com.
And if you found this episode helpful, we would really appreciate it if you could leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. It really does help other people find the show and join our community of curious minds. We are all just trying to figure out how our brains work, one prompt at a time.
It really does. You can find all of our past episodes, including the ones we referenced today on Vyvanse and the chemistry of focus, at myweirdprompts.com. We have a full archive there with show notes and links to the research Herman always brings to the table.
We are also on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and pretty much everywhere else you listen to podcasts. So make sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. We have some great topics coming up in the next few weeks.
Thanks again to Daniel for sending in such a thoughtful and relevant prompt. It is these kinds of real-world questions that make this show what it is. We appreciate you, Daniel, and we hope things go well with Hannah and Ezra.
It really is. It has been a pleasure as always, Korn.
You too, Herman. This has been My Weird Prompts. We will see you all next time.
Goodbye, everyone. Stay curious and keep track of those logs.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts.